Natural gardening might be our only way forward because with impending fertilizer shortages, costs of fuel skyrocketing, and looming questions about food security on the horizon, I feel pretty good. And I think a big part of that reason is because of how we've set up our garden. We don't really need fertilizer. We've got systems in place to generate our own fertility. And I find that our family utilizes huge amounts of what would otherwise be seen as waste to build healthy soil for our plants. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through what it looks like to take a biology first approach to your garden. We'll look at several practical ways that you can invest in your soil this growing season, and then I'll close out by showing you how you can stop wasting valuable resources and how to start turning them into garden fertility instead. Welcome back to the channel if you're new here. I'm Taylor, and I help home gardeners turn their yards into self-sustaining and regenerative growing environments, which I oftentimes call a natural garden. Now, I want to start off by first defining natural gardening. This is a term that I use to refer to a wide range of growing techniques and mindsets. It's sort of like the word regenerative. It can mean a lot of things, which also can mean that it doesn't mean anything. So my personal working definition for natural gardening is that it's a way of growing that prioritizes biology, makes investments in the soil, and that produces little to no waste, Sasha. And these are all things that we see happening in nature. Nature prioritizes keeping nature alive, keeping the biology thriving. Nature is set up to constantly reinvest into the soil. Everything is designed to feed the soil and replenish what was taken. And attached to that, nature is set up so that it intuitively solves the waste problem by utilizing everything to build the soil, feed plants, feed beneficial wildlife, and much, much more than we can actually see with our eyes. That is the kind of energy that we're infusing into our gardens when we choose the natural path. And if that sounds like something that you're interested in learning a little bit more about, how to actually do, stick around, because those are the things that we're going to be walking through. Now, one of the most important things to keep in mind for all of this is that a garden is not a fully natural space. I've talked about this before. Gardening, farming, any kind of agriculture is not fully natural. We're not letting plants drop their seeds on their own. At the very least, we've let the plants go to seed, collected the seeds, and then replanting those seeds. Most likely, you're buying seeds from other people who have done that work for you. You might be buying plants that people have started from seed for you. That doesn't happen if humans aren't involved. So with all of this, the natural gardening approach needs to be a gracious approach, not an all or nothing in or out. We do things in our garden that are not perfectly aligned with nature because we have to make trade-offs here and there. But it's still very important to carefully weigh each thing that you do in your garden, to think how it affects the biology within your growing space, because it's not just you in your garden. It's hopefully thousands of pollinators, beneficial predators, and billions of microorganisms in there as well, not to mention the plants. So when we start thinking about all of these other living beings, the full spectrum of biology that's represented in the garden, sometimes it helps to think about what we're going to take out of the equation, right? When I was growing up, synthetic fertilizers, turf builders, weed killers, pest killers were all pretty normal components within the home gardening toolkit. And back then, there were definitely people railing against the devastation that those were bringing on the planet. But it kind of seemed to me like most people didn't really care. Now, I don't know how much exactly has changed, but I do know that there is more awareness than there was. And you're probably not going to get teased too bad if you want to cut these out of your garden's diet. But just in case you haven't thought about it, let's take a look at what is happening when we use these things, starting with synthetic fertilizers. Now, I'll say that these are probably one of the less harmful things that you can add to your soil. But if you've followed our channel for long, you know that chemical fertilizers are designed to bypass the microbiology in the soil and just feed the plants nutrients directly. It would be like having all your meals fed to you through a tube directly to your gut. You'd stop using your mouth to chew your food, and as a result, over time, you'd start losing the ability to chew altogether, even if you wanted to. This is called atrophy, right? But if you stop chewing and exercising your face muscles, you also might start losing other things too, like your ability to talk might become a little bit more difficult. Other things will get affected, and the same happens when we bypass the biology in the soil, whose job is to feed our plants, and vice versa. That biology weakens from disuse, and so the immune defense components also start to be lost. The soil structure that gets built when microbial populations are strong in the soil stops getting built. So chemical fertilizers are less about directly harming biology, but they do sort of put the biology out of work. How about the weed killers? Well, the weed killers like Roundup, which honestly shocks me every time I still see it in the store being proudly displayed, they're certainly going to help you deal with the dandelions in your yard for your lawn, but they're also going to deal with the microorganisms that we just talked about. They're going to sanitize the environment in the worst sense of the word. They're going to irritate the beneficial insects, the pollinators, and the predators that you need to keep things balanced in your garden. And really, this is a huge mindset shift. I know that for many of you, this will not be hard to get on board with, but it was for me only about 5 or 6 years ago, so I'll just say it. Those native predators, right? The wasps, the beetles, the yellow jackets, and definitely the spiders, scary and annoying as they may be, are so good to have in your garden. They are the natural insecticides. We want to do everything to keep these guys in. Now, if these aren't present in your growing space yet, we want to be investing in native plants that provide food sources for native pollinators and other insects so we can start to round out that food web circle of life. And you can check out the link in the description to help you find some native plants that you might be able to bring into your garden this season or next. If you want to pick one to get you started, I'd say check out the native milkweed in your area if you live in the US. If you live in the US, there's dozens of varieties of milkweed, which are one of the primary food sources for monarch butterfly larvae. Just a thought. Now let's say you don't have any real diversity in your plants yet, your perennial plants, but you start incorporating more this year. While the ecosystem starts to round out, we can bring in our natural pesticides, right, to deal with our serious pest pressure. We've got our Jadam suite of natural pesticides always ready to use in case we need it. Because again, our garden is not a 100% natural environment. It's a garden. And even most of it at this point is going to be a market garden for us to sell flowers commercially. All that said, a natural garden is a place where harsh chemicals are ideally never used. Synthetic fertilizers are used very sparingly, and anything that is brought in ideally is done so with the intent of minimally disturbing the microecosystem. One more thing that I'll add that we really need to be thinking about in terms of removing is the amount of turf grass in your growing space. And I've come down hard on this in the past, and I recognize that there are big feelings out there about it. There's a lot of nuance to this discussion. My reasoning for encouraging you to decrease the amount of area strictly devoted to turf grass lawn is because it isn't quite enough of a net positive to justify the resources needed to keep it alive. In other words, lawns don't really feed anyone, especially when it's a monocrop single variety of grass with no other ground cover plants integrated, no flowers sprinkled throughout, and constantly cut to golf fairway length. Pollinators can't really use it. You certainly can't eat it. And whereas it does provide a space to stand with your bare feet, to keep it green, you're probably going to have to fertilize it pretty intensely. And depending on where you live, you're definitely going to need to water it. Now, grass is a great compost ingredient, right? It's a source of nitrogen for that. But if you're adding nitrogen to fertilize it and then cutting it to compost it, personally, I'd rather just grow food or flowers in that space, which is what we did for our lawn back here, and I have no regrets. Now, all of these subtractions you make are going to help you build your natural garden. But we also want to be thinking hard about what we're adding to the environment, right? And one of the best, most straightforward investments that you can make is in the soil. Probably no duh statement to you, but the soil is where everything that we see above ground stems from, and that is worth thinking about. I think that one of the main flaws in many home garden systems is that they're more interested in what they're taking out of the soil than what they're adding back into the soil. And just growing plants in the soil is generally a positive thing. Plant roots feed the soil biology, they help store carbon, they help build that soil structure. But there are some plants that frankly do this better than others. And I like to categorize plants into 3 main ways. There's the food crops, the aesthetic crops, and the beneficial plants. So for us, we've got our flowers that we're growing to be ready to sell. Right now, we've got our food crops that we're getting ready to plant the second that it is fully warm enough that we can feed ourselves with, and then we've got our beneficials, right? All of these plants are actually doing the work of feeding the soil biology through their root exudates and sequestering carbon and building the soil structure, but our beneficials are doing even more of the heavy lifting there. These are your native plants that we talked about earlier, but it's also your naturalized plants, right? Plants that maybe aren't native to your area, but are not invasive and won't take over. So plants like comfrey, yarrow, borage, nettles, lupin, hyssop, so many more. These plants are beautiful to look at, don't get me wrong, but their main value added comes in the form of their potential for building soil. These plants mine nutrients from the soil, they convert it into bioavailable forms, which they then store in their roots and gradually impart into the soil, or in their above ground biomass, which can then be taken and cut up and used as a mulch, used to make a natural fertilizer tea out of, or composted, which we'll come back to in a moment. Natural gardens make room for these plants that aren't giving you something that is immediately obvious, like a piece of fruit is. They're partners that are helping you build your soil. Another way that natural gardeners think about investing in their soil is by using high quality organic mulches. Again, there's nuance here. We're using landscape fabric as a mulch for parts of our farm so that we can reduce the amount of time spent weeding, but we also add organic matter to the soil at the beginning, at the end, and throughout the growing season to keep the soil biology fed. One of the primary ways that we build soil is by using Korean natural farming inputs to furnish the space with added biology, with minerals, and with other immune boosting compounds. We wouldn't have been able to get our gardens off of the ground without the Jadam microbial solution. We're making long-term investments in the soil by incorporating IMO4 indigenous microorganisms into our soil in and throughout the growing season. These are investments that we're making that are hard, maybe even impossible to see in the day-to-day, but in the month-to-month, season-to-season, we've seen that they really pay off. Compost is one of the most obvious systems to set up within your natural garden, but most people aren't really using it quite to its fullest potential. And at least from what I can tell, that's because it's not always seen as a component or even a system within the system of the garden. Instead, it's oftentimes seen as a sort of just catch-all area where the lawn clippings and maybe some fallen leaves can go. But then when we can start integrating it into the natural flow of the garden and utilizing it as a system, a lot can change. And this gets us into addressing our waste streams. It's my belief that one of the biggest travesties of modern gardening is the amount of time and energy spent to ship in external inputs, fertilizers, topsoil, compost, and other resources, while an equal amount of time and energy is spent shipping out waste. And let's just put this in perspective. In the US alone, it's an estimated 100 billion pounds of food waste is generated each year, approximately 40 billion pounds of which comes from households. This equals out to the average American throwing away about 100 pounds of food each year. If we average things out and do the math, that's nearly 500 pounds of food waste that our household alone wastes, except that it's not wasted for us. And this isn't me trying to brag about how great we are. It's actually the least that we can do, I feel like. But every single bit of food, if possible, is food that we end up turning into soil in one way or another. And we have several main ways that we make this happen, most of which involves feeding our food to some of our livestock, our food waste that is, either to our worms or our chickens. Once the weather heats up again, we'll get our black soldier fly larvae back online. And then bokashi is the other major enabler that helps us turn food into soil, food waste. And if you're not familiar with bokashi yet, go and check out our other videos on that. The point is, as a natural gardener, you have to start the habit of looking at something that you're about to throw away and asking, can I use this to build my soil? Silly and unrealistic as that might sound, we've got to start normalizing this. We have to start stigmatizing food waste. And especially when it means that we get to stop relying on the big corporations to sell us that fertility. We've got it in our hands already. We just got to use it. In nature, animals die, plants die, and their bodies fall to the ground. Other animals eat parts of them. Insects clean them up. Microbes putrefy and help re-impart the nutrients back in the soil. It's yummy. The accumulation of an animal's entire life, all the energy spent fueling the plant, right, never ends up in a landfill. It gets re-imparted. These are the kinds of systems that we want to be looking at when it comes to our homes and the way that our home gardens. And the way that we personally do this can be tracked in a number of ways, but I'll point out one component of the flow of resources and how we end up generating soil from our waste streams. Cooked food, meat, and leftover dairy goes into our bokashi buckets. We ferment the food scraps until we've got enough to build a compost pile. Meanwhile, we're feeding our chickens all of our yard debris, the weeds, the leaves, the carbon materials from around the yard. Most of it goes to our chicken pen for our hens to peck at. Once we're ready to build a pile, we pull out some of the bedding, we mix it up with our bokashi food waste, also mixing in some of our Korean natural farming inputs, and then we hot compost the materials to the point where they've been stabilized, right, and then ready to go on the soil. And then from here, we either sift the compost and use it as part of our potting mix, and we make a lot of potting mix, or we use it as a mulch in our garden beds. Once it gets on the soil, the biology in and on the soil starts to work on it, breaking it down into humus, and finally into bioavailable forms of minerals and nutrients for our plants to consume. This is one mechanism that we use to not just reduce our food waste, but to utilize it. Now, I'm not a big fan of fear-mongering. I don't like it when other people claim that the world is ending, or when I hear people trying to tell us that there are going to be food shortages and famine and food insecurity. So I'm not going to try to scare you into adopting a natural garden mindset. What I do want to ask you is to take personal ownership, take responsibility for your part in bringing the stability back to the food system, back to the ecosystem. I think that a lot of people see the huge problem or the huge set of problems that we're facing and then just get so overwhelmed that they start feeling hopeless. But the truth is, as much as you may have been convinced otherwise, you still have the ability to choose. You still have agency. The current approach that we see to most home gardens is not sustainable. If you have this space to garden, use it like you're taking care of someone else's space, because at the end of the day, it doesn't actually belong to you. Not to get too morbid, but you're going to die eventually and leave it to someone else, and it won't be yours anymore, even if it was in name only to begin with. I'm extraordinarily privileged and fortunate enough to not need to really worry when it comes to how I'm going to get my food. I don't live in a food desert. I definitely see food prices go up and down based on what's happening in the world at any given time. But honestly, the fact that I have the privilege of not needing to worry about food is a big part of the reason why we do this channel. I want to show you options, paths forward. I want this information to get out there. If you are looking ahead to this growing season and you feel like there are things that could be better, maybe things haven't quite been working, maybe you feel stuck, maybe you want to build or rebuild your garden the right way, using some of these principles and even more incredible techniques you can apply for our Natural Garden Reboot program. There's probably a bit more possible than you might realize. You can scan the code on the screen or hit the link in the description and you can schedule a time to meet with me and find out if we'd be a good fit. If you want to see more of the ways that we utilize our waste streams to make our garden a closed loop system, you can check out this video next. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.